She called me on a Tuesday morning, and the first thing she said wasn't hello. "We need to talk about the lake house, Dad." I was standing in my kitchen, still in my robe, pouring my second cup of coffee. The lake house. I'd built that place with my own hands, not metaphorically. I mean, I literally drove the posts, laid the decking, painted every board of that wraparound porch over 3 summers in my 40s. My wife and I called it our someday place. Someday we'll retire there. Someday we'll watch the grandkids catch fireflies off the dock. My wife passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. After that, the lake house became the only place I could still feel her. "What about it?" I said. My daughter's voice had that tone, the one she used when she'd already made a decision and was just informing me of it. I'd heard it when she told me she was dropping out of her second year at Ohio State. I'd heard it when she told me she was marrying my son-in-law after knowing him 11 months. "Reginald and I have been talking," she said. "The property taxes on that place are getting ridiculous. You're not up there half the time anyway. We think it's time to list it." I set my coffee mug down carefully. "That house isn't listed," I said. "That house isn't going anywhere, Dad." She said my name the way people say it when they think you're being sentimental past the point of reason. "It's just sitting there depreciating. We could get 400, maybe 450 in this market. That money could go into something smarter." Something smarter. For whom I didn't ask. Not yet. "We'll talk about this in person," I said. "Sure," she said, and I could hear Reginald in the background. And then she said something I almost missed because I was still processing the first part. She said, "Just so you know, I already called the county assessor's office to get the valuation updated." I said nothing. I just stood there in my kitchen while the coffee got cold. Here's what my daughter didn't know. What neither of them knew. And I wasn't ready to tell them yet. I retired 6 years ago from 31 years as a contracts attorney at a logistics firm in Columbus. I wasn't flashy about what I knew, never have been. Some men like to remind people of their expertise. I always found it more useful to let people forget. The lake house is on Clearwater Lake in eastern Ohio, a stretch of about 40 acres that my father-in-law originally purchased in 1971. When he passed, my wife inherited the parcel. When she passed, it came to me, but not the way most people assume property passes. My wife and I had done our estate planning carefully. We'd sat with an attorney friend of mine named Dale Whitmore, a trust and estate specialist I'd known since law school, and we'd set things up the right way. The lake house, the land, the structure, every nail in it was held in a revocable living trust, the Harlan and Susan Mercer Family Trust, to be exact. My name is Harlan. My wife was Susan. I was the sole trustee. I had amended the trust after Susan died. Not out of grief, though there was plenty of that. I amended the trust after Susan died. Not out of grief, though there was plenty of that. I amended it because I saw, even then, the shape of things to come. My daughter had started asking questions about the estate before her mother had been in the ground 2 weeks. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm saying I recognize what I was dealing with. The amendment I made was simple. It designated the lake house, upon my death or incapacitation, to pass directly to the Clearwater Land Conservancy, a nonprofit land trust that preserves natural areas along the lake corridor. My daughter and Reginald would receive my financial accounts, split with my son in Portland, but the land would go to conservation. I'd spoken with the Conservancy director, a woman named Paulette Osei, and she'd been grateful and discreet. My daughter didn't know any of this. She thought the lake house was just mine, a piece of property sitting in her father's name, waiting. She thought wrong. The weekend they drove up, I was already there. I'd gone up 2 days early. I wanted to sit with the place before whatever was coming. I fished off the dock in the morning, caught a bass I threw back. I walked the perimeter of the property the way my father-in-law used to, checking the fence posts, looking at the tree line. There's a white oak on the north edge that Susan and I estimated was about 200 years old. I put my hand on it the way I always do. They arrived Saturday afternoon. My daughter in her driving clothes, that particular brand of casual that costs $300, and Reginald in his weekend khakis, and the kind of expression that told me he'd been rehearsing something. They brought my grandson, who was 7 and blameless in all of this. He ran straight for the dock the moment the car stopped, and I let him go. And I watched him from the porch while my daughter and her husband came up the steps with their luggage and their agenda. We ate dinner together. I grilled chicken. My grandson told me about his soccer team. Reginald had 2 beers and got expansive the way he does, talking about his commercial real estate work, dropping numbers that were meant to impress me. My daughter watched me with the careful attention of someone who was waiting for an opening. After my grandson was in bed, they sat across from me at the kitchen table. Reginald did most of the talking. He printed something. I noticed the folded papers in his jacket pocket, and he laid out what he called the opportunity. Property values on Clearwater Lake had risen 38% in 4 years. A developer out of Cleveland had been buying up adjacent parcels. They had a contact. If I listed now, quietly, off market, I could clear $420,000. They'd already spoken to a real estate attorney, not Dale Whitmore, someone Reginald knew about the process. My daughter reached across the table and touched my hand. "Dad," she said, "you could move closer to us. We could find you something nice in Dublin. You wouldn't have to make the drive up here alone anymore." There it was, the concern dressed up as love, or maybe the love that had genuinely confused itself with want. I've thought about it a lot. I don't entirely know which it was. I looked at her hand on mine. "Let me think about it," I said. Reginald nodded like that was reasonable. My daughter squeezed my hand once and let go. What I didn't tell them, what I sat with alone that night after they went to bed, sitting on the porch in the dark listening to the lake, was that there was nothing to think about. There was no decision to make. You cannot sell a property held in a trust without the trustee's authorization. I was the trustee. I had not authorized anything. The real estate attorney Reginald had spoken to, whoever they were, had either not done their due diligence or hadn't been told the full picture. I thought about Susan, about the way she used to sit in that same chair and say the lake at night sounds like it's breathing. It does. It really does. I want to be honest about the next part because it's not something I'm proud of, the length of time I let it go on. I drove back to Columbus Sunday evening and I told myself I'd write them a clear letter explaining the trust structure. That was the decent thing to do. Clear the air, explain the legal reality, close the conversation. I didn't write the letter. Instead, over the following 3 weeks, I watched. My daughter called the county recorder's office. I know, because a woman I know there, a clerk named Bev, who I've dealt with for 30 years, mentioned someone had been inquiring about the property records on my lake parcel. My son-in-law had reached out to the Cleveland developer directly. I found this out when the developer's assistant called my cell number looking for the Mercer property contact, and I had a very illuminating 10-minute conversation with her that she probably did not intend to be illuminating. They were moving, not waiting for me to decide. Moving. I called Dale Whitmore. "They're trying to sell a trust asset without trustee consent," I told him. "Can they execute a sale without your signature?" he asked. "No." "Then they'll hit a wall at closing." "I know." "Then they'll hit a wall at closing." "I know, but I want to know what they've done so far. And I want to know my options if they've represented themselves as having authority they don't have." Dale was quiet for a moment. "Harlan," he said, "if they've misrepresented ownership to a third party to induce a contract, that's fraud." "I know what it is," I said. "I wrote contracts for 31 years. He made a few calls over the next week. What came back was worse than I'd expected and exactly as bad as I'd feared. Reginald, using letterhead from his real estate business, had sent a letter of intent to the Cleveland developer representing that the Mercer Lake property was available for private sale ownership unencumbered. He had not mentioned the trust. He had not mentioned that he was not the owner nor the trustee nor authorized in any capacity. He had, in short, committed fraud on paper with his business letterhead. I sat in Dale's office on a Wednesday afternoon in November and read the copy of the letter of intent that Dale had obtained through the developer's attorney, who was as unhappy about the situation as I was. "What do you want to do?" Dale asked. I folded the letter. I put it back on his desk. "I want to do this right," I said. "I did not call my daughter. I want to be clear about that. I know some people in my position would have called, would have confronted, would have had the blow up at the kitchen table that maybe should have happened years ago. I understand that impulse. I felt it. But I am a contracts attorney. I spent 3 decades learning that the moment you show your hand early, you lose the ability to control what happens next. So I waited. I let Reginald continue to believe the deal was progressing. I let my daughter continue to call me every Sunday and ask how I was doing and mention casually that she'd been in touch with some people about the lake house situation. The situation, she called it. I said things like, "I appreciate you looking into it, and let me know what you find out." And I meant none of it, and all of it because I did appreciate it, in the technical sense that it was giving me information. Meanwhile, Dale had contacted the developer's attorney and explained the trust structure in full. The developer, a man named Kirk Hadley, who I later learned had been defrauded in a different real estate scheme 3 years prior and had no patience for it, was furious. His company had already spent money on due diligence based on Reginald's representations. He authorized his attorney to refer the matter to the county prosecutor's office. I also contacted Paulette Osei at the Clearwater Land Conservancy. I told her what was happening. She was horrified and immediately put her organization's legal counsel on notice. The Conservancy had documentation of the trust designation going back 4 years. They were a named future beneficiary of the property. They had standing. It was, as Dale put it, a very tidy situation for you, Harlan, and a very untidy one for your son-in-law. The call came on a Friday morning in December. My daughter called me at 7:45, and she was not composed. "Dad," she said, and her voice had that particular quality that it had not had in our recent conversations. She sounded like she was 22 again, calling me from that apartment in Columbus when the hot water heater broke, and she didn't know who else to call. She sounded for the first time in years like my daughter. "Dad, Reginald got a call from a prosecutor's office. They're saying something about fraud, about the lake house. I was at my kitchen table. I had my coffee. The morning was gray outside the window, early snow threatening." "I know," I said. Silence. "What do you mean you know?" "I mean I've known for about 6 weeks," I said. "I know about the letter of intent. I know about the letter of intent. I know about the developer. I know Reginald represented the property as unencumbered when it isn't." More silence. Longer this time. "Dad, I didn't." She stopped. Started again. "I didn't know about the letter. I swear to you, I didn't know what he sent. And here is the thing I'll say about my daughter, because it matters. I believed her. Not entirely. I think she knew more than she's admitted to herself. But I believed she hadn't known the specifics of what Reginald had put in writing. She'd wanted the sale to happen. She'd encouraged it. But the fraud part, the letter part, I think that was Reginald moving faster and sloppier than she'd anticipated. "I believe you," I said. She cried then. Not long, but real. "Is he going to be arrested?" "I don't know. That's up to the prosecutor. The developer is pressing the matter." "What about, Dad, what happens to the lake house?" I set my coffee cup down. "Nothing happens to the lake house," I said. "It stays exactly where it is. It's held in a trust, sweetheart. It always has been. There was never a way for it to be sold without my authorization, which I never gave." Reginald was trying to sell something he had no legal right to touch. The silence this time was different. I could hear her processing it. The shape of what had actually happened forming in her mind. "You knew." she said. Not an accusation, something closer to awe. You knew the whole time and you let it happen. I let it document itself, I said. There's a difference. Reginald was not arrested that day. These things take time. The county prosecutor's office opened a formal inquiry in January. The developer's civil suit followed in February. Reginald retained a criminal defense attorney. An expense I imagine was significant, and the negotiations and proceedings that followed are not fully resolved as I write this, though Dale tells me the civil matter will likely settle and the criminal exposure, depending on the prosecutor's discretion, may result in a plea or diversion, given that no money actually changed hands before the fraud was discovered. My son-in-law is a man who confused proximity to wealth with possession of it. He looked at my lake house and saw an asset. He looked at me and saw an old man who could be managed. He was wrong on both counts, but I don't have the energy for contempt. Mostly I feel tired of it and sad for my daughter and fiercely protective of what Susan and I built together. My daughter and I have spoken almost every week since December. The conversations are careful and sometimes painful. She has apologized more than once. I've accepted the apologies because I believe in them and because she is my daughter, and because this is not the first hard thing our family has come through, and it probably won't be the last. She has not asked again about the lake house. I went up in March. First weekend, the road was clear. The snow had been heavy that winter, and the property looked tremendous. The white oak in the north field standing in about 8 inches of snow, the lake flat and gray under a pale sky. The dock I built with boards I cut myself still solid under my boots. I stood there for a while. I thought about Susan. About all the Sunday mornings we'd planned for and got some of and lost the rest of. About my grandson running for the dock last September, fearless and fast, just a boy in motion. I thought about what it means to protect something. Not from everyone, just from the people who would take it without understanding what it cost. Paulette Osei from the Conservancy drove out to meet me that afternoon. We walked the property line together, the way I used to walk it with my father-in-law. She pointed out a pair of sandhill cranes in the marsh at the east edge of the property, picking through the ice melt. She told me about the Conservancy's plans for a nature trail along the North Ridge, something families could use. Educational signage about the old-growth trees. This is a special piece of land, she said. Yes, I said, it is. We shook hands on the dock before she left. The lake was starting to show open water near the center. In another few weeks, it would be ready for fishing. I walked back to the house and made myself a sandwich and ate it on the porch in my jacket, watching the water. My phone buzzed once. My son calling from Portland to check in. I picked it up. Hey, Dad. How's the lake? Exactly the same as it always was, I said, which is exactly the point. He laughed, and I laughed, and the lake sat there in front of me doing what it always does, breathing in and out in that slow, patient way that makes you feel like the world is bigger than your problems and older and not particularly worried about any of it. I've lived 67 years. I know the difference between what lasts and what doesn't. The house is staying. I've been thinking about what I would say if someone asked me what this whole thing taught me. And the honest answer is that it didn't teach me anything I didn't already know. It just made me see it more clearly. Reginald looked at my lake house and saw a number, $420,000. He looked at me and saw a tired old man who could be steered. That's the thing about people who operate that way. They're not stupid, they just substitute cleverness for character. And they think those are the same thing. They're not even close. My wife, Susan, used to say that how a person treats what belongs to someone else tells you everything about how they'll treat what belongs to you. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I watched my son-in-law draft a letter on his business letterhead misrepresenting ownership of a property he'd never once helped build, never once paid a tax on, never once sat on the dock of at 6 in the morning watching the fog lift off the water. He wanted the reward without any of the history. And when you operate that way, reality has a way of sending you a bill. I'm not a man who believes in cosmic punishment exactly. I believe in cause and effect. I believe that the choices you make create the conditions you live in, and that eventually those conditions catch up with you, one way or another. Reginald made choices. The developer he misled had a lawyer. The prosecutor's office had a phone. Dale Whitmore had 30 years of trust law filed neatly in his memory. The consequences weren't fate, they were just arithmetic. What I keep coming back to is the question of what I did right, not in the legal sense, but in the deeper sense. And I think the answer is three things that I learned not from any book, but from watching my father work, and my father-in-law walk his property line, and my wife face her illness with more grace than I could have managed. The first is that you have to know what you actually have, not what it's worth on paper, what it means. I knew what that lake house was. Reginald never did, and that ignorance was his real vulnerability, not mine. The second is that you have to think clearly when the pressure is on, not react. Think. When my daughter called me from the car that first Tuesday morning, my chest tightened the way it does. But I set my coffee down and I waited. I let Dale make his calls. I let the situation document itself. Clarity under pressure is something you build over years. The same way you build a dock one board at a time, checking each one before you move to the next. The third is that you have to be willing to hold your ground even when the people asking you to give it up are people you love. That was the hardest part. My daughter. I held the line not because I didn't love her, but because I understood that protecting what matters sometimes looks like stubbornness from the outside. That white oak on the north edge of my property has been standing for 200 years. It didn't survive by bending to every wind that came through. It survived by having roots deep enough that the storms couldn't find the bottom of them. I'm 67 years old. I know where my roots are.